we are continuing to cover the enormous societal impact of the sexual harassment stories and related tales that are coming to light now about the misbehavior of powerful men. And our next guest, who has been on the program several times before, a good friend of the program, has written what I think is a very insightful and thoughtful article about an aspect of this whole subject that is being considered. And for lack of a better term, Helaine Olen is the author of Pound Foolish, Exposing the Dark Side of the Personal Finance Industry. She is also co-author of a book called The Index Card about personal finance. She has written for a number of years on the subject of personal finance, economics, business, and related topics. And she is the author of a recent piece in The Nation headlined Sexual Harassment Does Not Occur in a Vacuum. And she joins us now. Helaine, thanks for coming back on the program.
Oh, as always, thank you for having me on. I love the show, you know that.
Well, and we love having you on, sincerely. And this was an important, I think, an important contribution to the discussion. First of all, I feel just on the macro level that I feel as if everybody's finding their way through an altered landscape in so many different ways when it comes to gender relations and the dynamics behind them. Do you have that sense also?
Oh, yes. I mean, I met a male colleague for drinks a few weeks ago, and when he turned up, and I said, and by the way, thank you for coming. It was like, wait, are we supposed to be here together? Are we allowed to do this anymore? I mean, in all seriousness, it really is, and I mean, I'm joking about it because it's somebody I've known for a very long time, but it's something that you're really negotiating and thinking about things that you just took for granted before in a way that you no longer take them for granted. It's like everything is second guessed now, and every interaction you have to think about. It's really been a strange moment.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's healthy in the sense that I think it's, you know, evolution taking place. It's growing pains for a society that's discarding, like a snake discards its skin, discarding the dead skin of sexist behavior, or at least one layer of it. But at the same time, it does feel that people don't know how to apply principles of proportionality, of context, of, you know, that we're figuring it out as we go along. And now your piece on sexual harassment doesn't occur in a vacuum. First of all, I want to talk about every aspect of it. You mentioned, you start with the Ann Curry case. I think you wrote it not long after Matt Lauer was deposed from his throne at NBC. But you know, I was never a fan of Matt Lauer, by the way. I never liked him particularly. He seemed amiable enough. I never thought he was particularly good at his job. And I liked Ann Curry. And I was sorry to see her go. I thought she had a good spirit about her. But that aside, one of the things you address that I think we do need to come up with language for, a vocabulary for, is, you know, while Matt Lauer, for example, clearly has been accused of sexual harassment, what Ann Curry experienced, what women like Ann Curry experienced, it's not sexual harassment per se, is it?
No, but it's harassment. So I should go back and talk about the article for a moment. So yes, I've been talking about these sort of issues for a while privately with friends, my husband, whatnot, within the past few weeks. And when the Matt Lauer thing blew up, and I'm with you, by the way, I thought he was perfectly fine, but I never quite got why he was getting so much more money than his female co-hosts. It was really interesting to see Ann Curry's name come up. As for people who don't remember, who don't follow morning TV, Ann Curry was his co-host in 2010, 2011. Matt Lauer was very unhappy about it. People on the show made her life miserable in various and sundry ways. And eventually she got shoved out the door, most likely by Matt Lauer, as it was subsequently reported. And so when this was all 2010, 2011. So when Matt Lauer gets kicked out of NBC a couple of weeks ago, whose name starts turning up on Twitter but Ann Curry? And people writing, things like, I bet Ann Curry is happy today, and this is finally justice for Ann Curry, and so on and so forth. And you're like, wait a second, and nobody has ever alleged Ann Curry was sexually harassed. I mean, to this day, it has not happened. But she was most certainly harassed out of her job. And what it really occurred to me was that it sort of tied in what I had been thinking before I wrote the piece, which is that there's a bigger moment here. And I'm not the only one who's struggled to figure out what all of this means. I mean, most famously, Masha Gessen in The New Yorker has speculated whether it's something of a sexual panic, which tends to happen during historically troubled times, right? The Salem witch trial being sort of the famous example in times of change. But what I'm beginning to think is going on is it's this expression of women's incredible unhappiness in the work world combined with the absolute insult that is Donald Trump. And what I mean by that is that as some people here probably remember, during the Great Recession, women were going to be the stars of the work world after it ended, right? It was men had led us to this cliff. Remember, there were all these articles that testosterone was responsible for the horror show that had happened on Wall Street. And it was women whistleblowers who were going to rescue us. And men were getting fired from their construction jobs. And the new jobs were going to be in more collaborative industries that women are supposedly better at. And people speculated that men were going to be, their days were numbered as the head, ruling the roost in the workforce, and people wrote books about this. And then, of course, 2017 happens. And what happens? Men are thoroughly on top, right? We've got Donald Trump in the White House. We have men ruling the roost on Wall Street and Silicon Valley. In fact, women's workforce participation peaked in 2000, no difference made by 2008. There's barely an industry where women are paid equally, and you could just sort of go on down the line. Women's status is terrible in the workplace to an extent. We're judged horrifically. I go into this in the piece. Study after study shows that men are forever given the benefit of the doubt, whereas we have to prove ourselves over and over again. And I think there was just this kind of frustrated rage over everything, frankly. And when the sexual harassment stuff started to come out again, I think it was almost a way people had something to grab onto. I don't think it's just that people have been sexually harassed, though indeed the polls show a lot of women have been sexually harassed in the workplace. I think it's just this free-floating rage about everything.
Yeah, and it's, it's hard to know where that needs to be channeled or where it should be channeled first. But I think, I'm always of the school that says you can't really fight something until you name it. And therefore, we need to figure out a vocabulary that distinguishes what happened to, say, Harvey Weinstein's leading actresses, as, Rose McGowan or whomever, as from what happened to Ann Curry, let's say, assuming that there was no sexual harassment, which is a sort of pattern of gender-based humiliation, degradation, dismissal, diminution, based on the idea that, you talk about, for example, that young women in the workplace are considered not ready or unprepared, whereas men are considered promising, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'll just reference it. It was a study done about venture capital. And what they found was that when young men and young women went to get money from venture capitalists, the men were described as young and promising, and the women were described as young and inexperienced. Just so you know, if for people who don't follow this, which I imagine is most people, 95% of venture funding goes to men. I mean, it's an extraordinary number, right? Women can't be that awful, right? I would say I more or less agree with you, but I would add an issue in that this is really about power and who has it and who does not. And women definitively, for the most part, don't have it. And I think, so for instance, right now, one of the thrusts is going on is you immediately see, we need to do sexual harassment training in the workforce, right? Now, look, I'm certainly not against doing it. Hey, it's fine. But the idea that sexual harassment training would actually put a stop to this in and of itself is ridiculous. First, a lot of places already have sexual harassment training. Second, it kind of defies belief that a lot of this behavior would be stopped by simple sexual harassment training, because I find it hard to believe that there are a lot of men out there who think this is actually sort of okay. At least in terms of knowing that it's not like quasi-predatory, borderline illegal should they get caught, fill in the blank, right? And they just have to take a class and like, oh my God, you mean I'm not supposed to force the 24-year-old intern into a sexual relationship? Who knew, right? That's ridiculous.
Right, or you forgive the expression, dick pics or what have you, you know, or physical contact, unwanted. I mean, I do think most men in the workplace get that. But then the question is, okay, let's think about that other layer of disempowerment or of ratification, you know, signs of disempowerment that take place when men, you know, say, well, you know, you're pretty, or think, well, you're pretty, but you're not, or whatever, you know, or give women the Ann Curry treatment of mocking them, excluding them, not giving them the venture capital. So yes, I agree with you. It's definitely a reflection of a power imbalance. But how do you address that? I mean, it feels to me like a chicken and egg problem, where the diminution of the treatment, you know, this dismissive treatment, is a symptom of the power imbalance, and yet the power imbalance is reinforced by the dismissive treatment. So where do you step in and break this cycle?
I think when you start with awareness and actually making people question their own assumptions, right? I mean, the famous example goes back to, and this isn't in my article, people, should you read it, but it's a really good segue because it's a great example, is orchestras in the 1970s and 1980s. If you remember, they used to be almost all male. And when they first started to try to get more women in, because of course women play instruments just like men do, they were finding that women were still not being selected to be in the orchestras for the most part, right? So then somebody had this brilliant idea that people should audition behind a curtain so that you couldn't see, the judges, I mean, who was auditioning. And what do you know? More women started to get selected to be in the orchestra because the bias had been removed. Now, obviously, you can't quite make people invisible in the workplace, right? Or, you know, or at least not be able to know what sex they are. But I think you can really start by making people question assumptions and ask questions why, for instance, like in journalism, why aren't more women on the front page of newspapers? Why are women shunted into writing about parenting and education and lifestyle while men write about business and politics? And why aren't more women directing films? And maybe you should be taking a look at the number of females on staff in the writers' rooms and so on down the line. I mean, these are things that are not actually that hard and could be done without huge amounts of difficulty, and really enforcing the awareness.
Well, it's a great point, and I think we should keep on that. And I just have a last question for you, and it's not going to be an easy one to answer, and I apologize in advance for that, but it's important, I think, and it's something else to ponder, which is there's a kind of, people are saying, well, listen to women, you know, which I heartily endorse, but then people are also saying it's not up to women to correct the misbehavior of men or the distorted perceptions of men or the power imbalances generated by men, which I also agree with. So for myself, it's a personal struggle between, obviously I'm listening to you, I do listen to women on this subject, I take women's leadership on this subject, but, and it's not up to women to make men better people. But do you have any thoughts on that struggle?
God, that's so hard, because what I would say is I actually think a lot of men, probably most, are actually fairly decent on these subjects, right? Or at least neutral. I mean, most men, for the record, are not harassing anybody, right? They're not just not doing this. They know better. And I think we need, and again, I think it goes back to the power imbalance. And I think as a society, we assume that the typical person is a man, and women have been sort of forced, and I should say a white man, right? So black men, white women, women of color, gay people, you know, I should say straight white male, right, are sort of forced to adhere to those standards. And I think the way we need to do this is to really open our conversation up and and start questioning all of those assumptions. And I think only then are you going to start breaking the logjam of who is responsible for calling people out on these sorts of things and getting change to happen. Because on one hand, it is going to fall to a lot of women and other people to call BS on this sort of behavior, because that's historically how people do it, right? But on the other hand, I think the more awareness there is, the more awareness there is. Things tend to grow upon themselves, so to speak. And over time, they change. I mean, for all that we're talking about this and all that we're complaining, it's worth noting that even 50 years ago, the amount of women that would have been in the workforce to even experience this sort of problem at anything above a very low level was very small. I mean, so there has been enormous change, and we do take that for granted sometimes. So it is possible, and it can happen.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, and I also think that, you know, as we go through this unknown territory that we're all exploring together, I think it's worth men and women both sort of embracing the change process as being something that will be at times painful, but in the end will be to the benefit of everyone. At least I like to think so. So Helaine Olen, a finance writer, author of Pound Foolish, and of the recent article in The Nation, which I encourage everybody to check out, Sexual Harassment Does Not Occur in a Vacuum. Helaine, as always, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me on.